Hello, everyone. Welcome to Live from New Amsterdam. This is brought to you by the New Amsterdam Project at the New York Historical Society and by the New Netherland Institute in Albany, New York. Live from New Amsterdam is a lunchtime monthly Zoom conversation with someone who's doing interesting work in New Netherland and early New York. My name is Russell Shorto. I'm the director of the New Amsterdam Project. My guest today is Lavada Nahon, and I think we'll see her on the screen any second. There she is. Lavada is, in her day job, she is interpreter of African-American history for the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historical Preservation, Bureau of Historic Sites. That's a mouthful. She is also, there are going to be a lot of food analogies here. She's also a culinary historian and independent scholar, and this is where her work in particular is going to be what we're going to be focusing on today, specializing in the Mid-Atlantic, especially New York, from the 17th to the 19th centuries. And to round out your bio, Lavada, I pulled a quote from your website. "My mother always said she had 3 daughters, one to cook, one to clean, and one to sew. I am the cook." Lavada,
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, Russell, and thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah. Before we get into food and culinary history, talk a little bit about your job with State Parks and Recreation. You are the interpreter of African-American history for New York State Parks, correct?
Yes, I'm the first. It is a position that was created and I entered in November of 2019. As Parks has worked for years to be more inclusive and more expansive in our interpretation of history at the various historic sites and all of the signage at the state parks, they brought people to the table whose voices were missing. So it is my pleasure and honor to be the first in this position. And we also now have an interpreter for Native American history.
And so, I mean, that sounds like a vast array that you have to cover, the whole state and interpreting African-American history.
Yes, and many people don't realize that New York State Parks is one of the largest, if not the largest, park system in the country. We have over 220 parks. We own 35 historic sites. 13 of them are actually in the colonial and new nation periods. And
you were, when last we were together, you gave me and my colleague Dennis Micah a tour of the Phillips Manor Hall site in Yonkers, the new permanent exhibit there, which you were involved in creating.
Yes, I was one of the creative leads and also lead on the interpretation team. I'm very proud of that exhibit.
It's
it really is the pinnacle of my work.
Yeah, it's a beautiful exhibit. Okay, so let's start talking. When we were talking yesterday, you said that you had been immersed in Pinkster events.
Yes.
This is the season of Pinkster, which I think very nicely brings together some of the things we're going to be talking about. So maybe you can tell people what Pinkster is.
Pinkster is a shortened version of the Dutch word, which I never pronounced right, Pinkersten, for Pentecost, which is the second major feast of the Christian year. And many people are not aware because, we often don't study Black history far enough back that many of the enslaved, particularly those coming out of Congo and Angola, were either Christian or had been exposed to Christianity anywhere from 100 to 150 years before the slave trade. So it is one of the few times in the year that the enslaved can gather more than 3 and without a lantern and permission. And they travel to large sectors if given the time off. Not everyone was given that time off to celebrate. They had 3 to 5 days. And we know some of the larger gatherings happened in Albany. We also have documents that show them happening at several of the marketplaces in New York City. And also out on Long Island, we have references also of people who gathered close to where they were because they were too tired to travel further. The documents show the presence of African culture. It is the most documented presence of African drums being played, African languages being shared, and their basic culture being retained and maintained and celebrated. So it is both a cultural celebration and a religious celebration. And unfortunately, it was banned in 1811 in Albany and heavily suppressed in the what we want to call the pre-Civil War years in lieu of things like election days and federal celebrations. So we've been trying to recapture this history because many of us grew up with the false impression that Africans had no culture other than what the Europeans gave them, and we all know that that is a deep and profound untruth. So when we have that legacy, particularly living here in New York, is important because many similar celebrations also happen throughout the Caribbean, where both the Congolese and the Angolans went.
So this is a case where, because this is a Dutch holiday and people were actually given, and enslaved Africans were actually given some time off, they took advantage of that to make the holiday their own, essentially. And
yes.
Go ahead.
And one of the things I want to say, we say the Dutch brought it here. Well, they brought it here under the name of Pinkster, but anyone who is Christian celebrates Pentecost. It is the beginning of the Christian church. So for the British, it would have been Whit Sunday. But yes, there is a Congolese Christian rite. So they brought their faith and their practices here using their instruments, their languages, their way of expressing themselves.
Okay, so let's broaden this to orient people. New Netherland is the Dutch colony in the New World that predated New York. So in the 1600s, ending in 1664 when the English take it over and rename it New York. And it's really a mixing of three cultures or three groups of cultures. You have not just the Dutch, but European, because there were many other Europeans. You have the Native Americans whose land was who were steadily being dispossessed of their land, but who were very much a presence. And they are not just one thing, there are many different groups. And then you have the Africans, and as you say, they are mainly from Congo and Angola, that part of Africa. And if I understand this right, they're all basically, we're talking about food now, they're all basically working with the same ingredients, right?
Yes, they are. It is a huge adaptation, both for everyone. Most of the African ingredients, even the foods that were used on the slave ships, won't grow in our area. We're just too cold. So what everyone is really dealing with are ingredients that are native to our particular area, as well as those that were brought here by the Dutch. And we find those references in a wonderful book, what you and I have spoken of a lot, is Adrian van der Donk's A Description of New Netherland.
That's one of the main sources, because he actually goes into the flora, the fauna in some detail. He goes into Native American societies and how their processes of how they approach childbirth and making meals. And he really gets, more than anyone else, I think, tries to get to do this broad description of the people and their culture.
And it's wonderful because we have, he just gives such richness to it. I am forever grateful for his depth of curiosity, that he goes out and explores and is curious enough to ask questions. In that book, although very slim, I mean, he asked the indigenous, where do they get their corn seed from? And they talk about from tribes from the South. He watches how they prepare food. He speaks of all of the fish and fauna and the vegetables and just so much more. So I went through that book years ago and just pulled out all of those food references. So we have all of those wonderful gardens and all of the vegetables that are there. And they ate a much broader range of foods than we currently have available.
Okay, so let's focus on Native Americans for the time being and give us an idea of what that range was.
Well, that range for them really are all of the native plants, all of the fish and fauna. I mean, we don't really think about the range of foods from small game like squirrels and beaver tails and possums and brown fish and sturgeon and all of those, and then all of the wild greens. There are things that are missing that they then from the Europeans fall in love with. Of course, there are all the sweetbreads and the sugar and those types of things. But the wealth of just the birds that were available, the fish and the clams and oysters and things that were available to them is pretty broad.
And in terms of how this starts to cross over, the Europeans, Africans, using products from here that they weren't used to in the home country. The Europeans also brought seeds, they brought trees, they brought livestock. How does it begin to merge these traditions?
Well, one of the things that I just remember a quote from Peter Rose, the noted Dutch culinary historian, who told me once that an indigenous person informed her that it is the Dutch that taught the natives to eat pork. So things like bringing over cattle, bringing over pork, bringing over the sugar and the spices, even to this day in the Hanadasi area, there is a holiday Christmas tradition of a cookie, a type of Dutch donut that is served, and it is heavily spiced. It's based really on early gingerbreads and those kind of spiced breads. That is still part of their tradition today. And that goes the other way, where we know that sampan, basically cornmeal mush, was favored by the Dutch, and that maize is a native grain, particularly Iroquois white corn is a native grain that was used and quickly adapted. And it becomes the equalizer. We see maize, or what we now call cornmeal, used in Africa. It was moved to Africa for the slave trade. It falls between the harvest of the grains there, and it is found now throughout the entire diaspora. So it is those kinds of back and forth and that sharing, because it takes a while. You know, we want to just think that the Europeans came here and were able to immediately put seed in the ground, but we have to remember it will take a while, because they have these major trees that have to be cleared. They have these fields that they have to create. And while they're waiting, what are they eating? They're eating the native plants. They're eating the native things that are, and many times we see that they're adapting even or adopting even the native way of planting things, you know, the whole three sisters, planting the corn and the beans and the squash together, because it will, I don't know how many people have gardens in New York, but I know in my yard to dig a hole is to dig up rocks. So we have all these stone fields, all these stone walls and fields all over the state. And well, it will take time to clear that. So then once the fields are clear, once the vegetable plots are clear, they can start then planting those European vegetables and things. But in the meantime, what are they surviving on? They're surviving on things that are native to New Netherland, and learning methodologies from the indigenous about how to plant and when to harvest.
I want to remind people that we will take your questions. If you want to type questions into the Q&A in a few minutes, I'll start transmitting some of those to Lavada, as many as we can. So you mentioned Peter Rose, and I wanted to bring her up. She's kind of the modern interpreter of a lot of this tradition, right? Especially the Dutch tradition in the 17th century.
In terms of foodways, she is the foundation on which we stand. It is her curiosity about her culture here that helps us know so much. I mean, she starts with translating and working with others to help translate The Sensible Cook, which was part of a larger book called The Pleasures of the Country Life, that I think the copy she used is from Historic Hudson Valley's collection, but it's a collection of books basically on how to set up a farm, right? There's one on butchering, there's one on farming, and there's this wonderful cookbook. And a lot of those were separate books that were published in the Netherlands, then bound in a book and then brought here. And it is in that
And that's,
work.
what's the date of The Sensible Cook? Do you know off the top of your head?
I don't. I think some of those, it's early 17th century. Some of those recipes are
Early
even earlier.
1700s, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it seems to me that the two sources on that period are Vanderdonk's description of New Netherland and then The Sensible Cook.
Correct.
Yeah. And then you've got Peter, and we've got Lavada now. And you do, you have done, you do interpretive, you do in costume even at events around the Hudson Valley, I think. Or do you still do that?
I'm trying to get off the hearth. It is a slow process for many reasons. I mean, we are seeing a great decline, unfortunately, in living historians. People are not picking it up as a hobby, and we're trying to
People
change
who reenact
that.
and
People who may be just interested in it, who want to go to a historic event and be in period clothing with a kit, with a tent, and hang out and just enjoy the presence for the day. And that absence of people who are interested in doing reinterpretive work in period clothing is really going to hurt us as we go towards these major anniversaries. When we have museums and historic sites and other people and other places who would like to do programming to show the public really how people lived or how people adjusted as best we can. But we don't have the bodies, and we really don't have the bodies when it comes to African Americans willing to step into the roles of either enslaved or free Blacks for the colonial period. I just recently had to leave one event, a Pinkster event, to go support Historic Huguenot Street for their 17th century market that will be happening June 10th and 11th in New Paltz. And this is something that we have to change. We're doing a lot of work expanding this history, broadening, bringing all these stories that have been ignored forward, bringing the multiculturalism that has always been New Netherland and always been New York forward. But it is about how do we get the public to engage in that history and to be willing to step out and relearn, honestly, a history that they didn't know to start with.
So take us through, if you can, some hands-on. I mean, if you're cooking in front of an audience at a festival or something, what might you be cooking? How is it different from the way we would do it? How does it integrate different cultures?
Well, one of the things, of course, is the style of cooking. Everyone all over the world is working on fire, right? Just how are they doing that? So we have natives using clay pots. We have then the Europeans bringing in the iron pots, Africans aware of iron pots. Everyone's using wooden spoons. So we start with that fire ring, and then you can balance a pot on 3 stones, or you can use a Dutch oven with feet. And then from there, what do you want to produce? In most cases, most people want to keep it simple. So we're going to do some kind of soup or stew. And then there's going to be a grain. And for Pinkster, I've been doing a lot of the cornmeal mush. For natives, it's called cornbread. It has the proportion of cornmeal to water is less, so it's much denser, but it can also be looser to be a porridge. So you can have that for breakfast with milk, as the Dutch did. You can make it denser, put in dried blueberries, as the natives did. Or in Africa, you find it in both styles. Both dense, it's called kuku, or you will have it as porridge. Everyone is familiar with some type of soup or stew, beans. I tend to do kidney beans because they are indigenous to our area, but also it is one of the few of the Native American beans that go from a cold culture all the way down to a hot climate. So you have red beans and rice in Louisiana. Well, those red beans are kidney beans, and they show all the way through, and they're native. And then from there, what you add to it really depends on how active you want to be. For me, while I am on the hearth, I try to keep it simple because I'm moving between my eyes on the fire and my eyes on someone's child and talking to the public at the same time while I'm trying not to burn things. But I have had the pleasure of doing very elaborate meals on the hearth, both within interior structures or out at events off a fire ring. So you can roast. The wonderful thing about Dutch ovens, you can do everything. You can bake in them, you can fry in them, you can boil in them, you can saute in them, whatever methodology that you need to do. You can do that. But it is about, particularly around Pinkster, just keeping in mind that the enslaved are traveling. Even within an urban environment, you have to move from the house that you are bound to like Pinkster Hill in Albany, to that camping site that you're going to be at for several days. So what can you take with you? One of the challenges I think most of us face is remembering that we need to keep things in seasonal foodways, right? So we're not going to start whipping out strawberries in May. If we're going to be doing a live program, then that would be dried fruits or some very wizened apples. I tend to then do a lot of just vegetarian things. And this time of year, I love dandelion greens. Most people, want to spray them and pretend they're a weed, but they were brought here by the Europeans for the fact that they self-seed and create a really lovely green that you will have in the spring. And they're also used as a medicinal. And with apple cider vinegar on them, a little salt and pepper. The enslaved may not have had the black pepper, but access to salt is available. So that gives you a nice fresh green to go with that. And I think yes, they're not native.
Intentionally, they were.
Yes, they were.
As a salad crop.
Yes.
How interesting. Growing up, my dad would go out in the backyard. We thought he was nuts and pull dandelions and, make a salad out of them.
Right. No, or you can go to the grocery store and pay like $5 a pound for them, or you can just go out into a field.
And the roots, I think you can eat.
Yes, you can use the roots, you can use the flowers and the leaves. It's a completely usable plant.
Okay, so kidney beans are another, what's an example of something that's kind of kidney bean based?
Well, you can boil the beans and you can mix them into that mush bread, or you can just use them as a stew alone. You can put in, we have wild onions coming up this time of year. You can add the greens in there if you want greens added to that. But then also coming out of the root cellar, remember, everything's a little wizened, a little thin right now, but you would have those root vegetables left over, things like carrots. You could add in, we don't want to put in celery, right now everyone wants to put in celery in soup, but celery is not there. But all of those root vegetables, like any leftover turnips, any of your dried squash you may have, anything to fill that out. You could add bits of meat, you could add fish, you could add squirrel, you could add rabbit. If you were fortunate enough to be able to catch, a wild turkey, or if you had any salted pork, you could add in there. So that can become a filling meal into itself. Remember, having that corn and having those beans together, that's a complete protein, right? So that's a very filling and very wholesome meal. We put a lot of emphasis on food, but really for those that are enslaved and free, particularly going to Pinkster, the focus really is on fellowship. It is about seeing people you have not had an opportunity to see, and the joy that comes with that reunion. Because even if you live near someone, that does not necessarily mean that you're seeing them on a daily basis. If someone is coming from far away, or if you've had family or friends sold off to another location, it is to Pinkster that most will try to return to. I love in Fenimore Cooper's book, Satan Toe, which is based on a Pinkster celebration, the main character is surprised by the laughter. He comments several times about all this laughter. And that's that healing, that laughter of relief that you are seeing someone you haven't seen in a long time, or just the laughter of joy because somebody told a good joke or somebody did something fun.
Yeah. I want to get to some of these questions. Someone's asking about herbs and spices that were used. How did they season?
We know that there's not much salt in the native diet. So salt in all of the herbs and spices that we use are brought here by the Europeans. There are a few that I think are overused because we overuse them now that are predominantly medicinals. Like there's very little garlic in period food. There's very little basil. You know, we lean heavily now on those northern, on the Italian spices that come in the 19th century. But what we have here, then all your sweets, what we call sweet herbs. You have parsley, thyme, rosemary. One of the things that we don't see very much anymore are the savories. We have both summer savory and winter savory. That are heavily used. Then you have a huge range of then your old world spices. Of course, nutmeg is the dominant spice going from the 17th into the 18th century. But you also have cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, allspice, all of your peppers. We have some cayenne here. We can document the presence of cayenne here. So you get a little kick in things if you would like that. But the whole array, rosemary is here, you know, all of those herbs and spices that we use, or bay leaves are here, are brought in by the Europeans. The Dutch controlled this spice trade. You know, that is one of their major trade items.
So a lot of these things you're mentioning came from the East Indies,
yes,
and then became part of European cuisine.
Yeah, so we see them used by the ounces and ounces in food. So things are spiced a lot heavier than we do now. For most part, we only see that level of spice in things that we've now reduced down to like Christmas dishes.
Oh, that's interesting. They, by our reckoning, overspiced in many things.
Right, but I happen to like it. So, you know. It's a personal taste.
Yeah. Okay. Someone's asking about what native plants and animals that sustained our early ancestors are extinct today.
Ooh, that's a good question.
Okay, I'll let you ponder that.
Well, yeah, that would be hard because, you know, some things are actually on the upswing again. We know we lost some fishes when the Hudson River got very polluted. Like things like sturgeon were taken almost to extinction, but they're bad. Yeah, the shad weren't running and things have, but now that the Hudson has been cleaned up, a lot of the fish are returning. This time of year, particularly when you go into the early summer, you'll have the shad runs, you'll have the alewife runs coming up, and we are eating still the oysters and clams and the mussels in the Long Island area, but those beds went way up the Hudson River. For a long time.
We don't have the oysters the size of a dinner plate anymore.
No, we don't. And as you and I have discussed, we have all of this, just so many oyster recipes in manuscript cookbooks that can be found across the state that we can't reproduce because it's not on my budget.
Right. Someone wants to know if there are any restaurants serving the foods of New Amsterdam.
The closest, not really. I mean, Frost's Tavern, depending on the year and who the head chef is, some of that things come on and off. But the dishes are easy to prepare. I think the most challenging of the dishes of the period really are and that happens later in the 18th century as we get into all the puff pastries. But a lot of the dishes are very straightforward. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about Peter Rose's receipt books or her cookbooks is that she has adapted almost all of these for the modern kitchen. So I would encourage you folks to get the books, go to your libraries if you don't have them. They're readily available in most libraries. And you can also just purchase the books off Amazon. Go cook.
Someone wants to know how you first became involved in reenactments and where in the New York City or Hudson Valley area are reenactments happening?
How did I get involved? Well, I've always been that kid who liked dressing up. And my initial work, particularly around the Dutch foodways, was because I was curious about some rooms that are upstairs in the Brooklyn Museum. And in many of our museums, like the Met and the Brooklyn Museum, they have, these beautiful rooms that have been taken out of places all over. But the ones in Brooklyn, there are several Dutch rooms. And I was like, where's this Dutch stuff coming from? And I was looking at that hearth and I started asking questions, and people were like, oh, you need to go down to the New York Historical Society. Oh, you need to connect up with the culinary historians of New York. So I did. And I was very fortunate, and I was probably like in my late 20s, early 30s when this was going on, to then meet people like Peter Rose, like Dr. Alice Ross, who for a long time taught historic cooking at her house in Smithtown, Long Island. She had converted her carriage barn, and there was a hearth, there was an iron stove, and she had a pit in her driveway where we would do native cooking. And I studied with her doing master classes for years. And then from there, because I was a Girl Scout, so I had done live fire work for a long time, camping, and I'm from Texas, so barbecuing is real. And my mother was a farm girl, so I also cooked in our very fancy fireplace in our house in Dallas, where I grew up. So it was just easy for me to make that transition. I actually started 18th century reenactment when I went on staff with Historic Hudson Valley, but I also was a member of the Society for Creative Anachronism. So I did medieval and Renaissance reenacting too. I just find it interesting. I don't want to sit there and watch people do things. I want to do them. I want to have the experience that way. And the only way to really get that grasp, particularly for me in studying the enslaved cooks in the elite houses, is to emulate them, is to put on the clothes and go to the hearth and do the work. I have gained a great amount of respect for them. I've been privileged to do large dinners. I did several for Historic Hudson Valley that, one meal off a hearth feeding anywhere from 20 to 25 people at a time. And the next day I was flat, right? So to think that these women had to do this day in, day out, taught me a lot.
Yeah. Lavada, I told you at the outset that this 30 minutes was going to fly by. It has flown by.
Oh, wow.
Thank you very much for this. We could go on, and maybe if you're willing, we'll have you back. And there are a lot of questions we didn't get to. So,
and I look forward to seeing just those questions, and you'll shoot them off to me.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we'll
to
send
see
them
what
to
they
you.
were.
Good, good. All right. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks very much, Lavada. Take
Thank
care,
you.
everybody.
Bye,
Yep,
everyone.
bye-bye.